Why is it that so many people today are so anxious? It seems like anxiety is one of those big things that's plaguing society, right up there with, other issues, right? That get a lot more play, other psychological issues and drug addiction, alcoholism, and things like that, right? Depression. And, it seems like there are so many people who are on medication of one kind or another for anxiety, whether we're talking about, benzos or we're talking about antidepressants or what have you. And this is a common complaint. I have been teaching college for a number of years now. More years than you would think by looking at me, right? And it seems like this is something that's especially pervasive among young people. It seems like this was one of the biggest complaints that I would hear from young people about what was troubling them, and it was anxiety. Whether we're talking about a generalized anxiety that is with someone all the time, or more acute, right? But I want us to think about this because I do think that it is something that has gotten much worse or more pervasive in the modern era. There are aspects of modern life, and a lot of people have talked about this, but there are aspects of modern life that really increase anxiety. And so what I want to talk about is what I have gathered, as someone who also has struggled with anxiety, what I have gathered from some of the philosophy and the psychology and the literature that I've looked at, and also what works for me or what helps me, because I do think that part of dealing with anxiety is getting into a particular frame of mind that helps to calm that, and it may not be what you're thinking of, right? So I wanted to, I've been talking about philosophy and psychology a lot, and particularly in my last video, and I'm doing a whole series this week on topics in philosophy and psychology and literature that I find interesting. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about is anxiety. Now I want to start by talking about the root or the roots of anxiety. And we're going to go all the way back to a look at Freud for that, because he has some really interesting things. Freud and the Freudians have some interesting things to say about the root of our anxiety, and it may not be what you think. And then I want to look also at this idea of modern life. What is it about modern life that tends to engender or increase anxiety? And then finally, I want to look at strategies that I have found helpful and certain perspectives that help me to deal with anxiety. Now, one of the things that we have to understand is that anxiety is something that is rooted in childhood, and it is rooted in a certain childish perspective on the world. Now, I am not saying that people who suffer from anxiety are childish. What I am saying, though, is that often the anxiety that we feel is not the result of actual legitimate things that threaten us in the present. Often, the anxiety that we feel is a kind of an almost a generalized or hard to define or hard to pinpoint anxiety attached to our place in the world with other people in our everyday life, right? A lot of people who suffer from anxiety, they'll tell you they feel it all the time, pervasively. And so what Freud and some of his disciples had to say is very interesting about this. They invite us to go back and to think about our earliest experiences in the world. You don't remember them. You don't remember what it was like when you were born. But if you think about it, one of the most traumatic moments of your life, perhaps the traumatic moment of some people's lives, is when you were born. Imagine what that is like, to go from the safety and the comfort and the kind of warm claustrophobia of the womb to then being pushed out of something, probably almost feel like you're smothering on the way out, right, in a very sort of violent way, and then you're popped out of this cocoon, and there's, bright lights if you're in a typical hospital, or if you're in a nice birthing center, maybe the lights aren't so bright, but all of this stimuli that you've never experienced before. And it is an extremely, and this is one of the things that Freud and some of the others identified, our foundational initial experience in the world is one of extreme stress and anxiety. Why do you think the babies cry when they come out, right? Do you ever see the babies come out and like as soon as they're out, they're just like, hey, yeah, I'm so happy to be here? No. On many, many different levels, existence and the beginning of existence, birth, very, very traumatic. And so if you think about the fact that our initial experience in this world is one of a kind of a trauma, then in a way that sort of sets things up in a Freudian perspective for us to then experience the rest of our lives with that kind of a hangover almost, right? And there's not much you can do about that. But then what happens to compound that or to build upon that is that very early on, the infant may not know much of what's going on around it, right? But it recognizes very early on that its entire survival is dependent on its parental figures, whether we're talking about the actual parents or we're talking about, whoever's taking care of the child, right? And that child, that infant, on some basic level, it doesn't know much, but it knows that when it wants food, it has to cry, and that it takes a while sometimes for the food to be delivered. Or when it wants someone to comfort it and it cries, it takes a while sometimes for someone to come and do that. And so our initial experiences with our caretakers, they are not wholly good or wholly welcoming or completely happy. There is a high degree, though we don't remember it, there is a high degree of anxiety attending our place in the world, our feeling of our place in the world, because we recognize on some basic existential level when we are babies that we are entirely dependent on these beings that we have no control over to give us everything, right? And those beings might not always be consistent, right? They're not perfect. And so early on, we establish a kind of an anxiety surrounding this and this relationship, right? And this is one of the reasons why people feel so much anxiety in public situations. What is it about being around other people that causes so much anxiety when it really shouldn't? Well, it's because our first experience of people was that early experience with our parents, and there was so much anxiety tied to that initial relationship that we experience our later relationships in a sort of a similar vein. We don't want to lose people's approval. Like, think about someone who's a people person, someone who can never say no, someone who's always saying, I'm sorry, and that sort of thing, right? What's going on with that person is that they have overestimated the power of others' emotions or others' disapproval. They have blown it up out of proportion so that they feel that if they assert themselves and that person doesn't like them, or that person gets angry, or that person is offended, then they feel like it's shaken their world up, right? And that's because our early experiences with our parents had that feeling. On a very primordial level, you as a baby and as a child, you understood that if you made your parents too angry, they might stop feeding you. They might kick you out. Right? Now, of course, if they were good parents, then they wouldn't. But I'm talking about the way that we perceive the world. There's a lot of stuff that we don't understand, right? About how we process things when we're very young. And so because this is what Freud and some of the others were getting at, because when we were children, the stakes in our relationship were so high, right? You don't want to make mom and dad unhappy because they can take their love away. And if they take their love away, then who's going to keep me alive, or who's going to take care of me, or whatever, right? Because the stakes were so high, we often take that same feeling and that same ungrounded fear into our relationships with other people. And people who have high anxiety and high social anxiety, or people who have or who are people pleasers, who are afraid to say no, who are afraid to assert themselves, I guarantee you, 90% of those people, if you look at their childhoods, what you're going to find is that one or more of their parents were probably exceptionally authoritarian, or over-disciplinarians, or even abusive, whether emotionally or physically. And so what's happening with a number of these people pleasers, and by the way, I'm not just talking about men, right? I mean, there are a lot of people, women often get a pass on this, but there are a lot of people walking around with a great deal of anxiety because they have had problematic mothers. And it need not just be in terms of authoritarianism. It can be all kinds of other ways in which we learn as we are growing up that we cannot fully depend on our parents. And again, I'm not blaming parents. This is just part of being human. But I am saying that this is where a lot of anxiety comes from. And so that's part of it, right? And the way that Freud and some of his disciples described this, they likened it to the idea of a lion. We developed in an evolutionary sense, we developed to live in a very primitive society, okay? It is only within the last, as you know, it is only within recent history that modern technology has developed. And so if you look back for most of human history, we were basically living at the level of animals. We were living like animals and very primitive. And if you believe in like Darwinian evolution and stuff like that, you think about primitive to the extreme of very animal existences with lots of predation. Or, think of the cavemen and stuff like that, right? Or just, think of 60 minutes ago in some places. Lots of violence, lots of predation, lots of fear, lots of instability, lots of chaos. This is what we evolved for biologically, physiologically. Now, our brain does not understand on a basic primordial level, it does not understand that we are in a safe environment now. Like here I am, I'm sitting here in a computer lab, there's probably not anything that's going to hurt me, right? And yet I did not evolve in an evolutionary sense, I did not evolve to sit in a computer lab. I evolved to be, out there, in nature, in the wilderness, facing danger. And so what happens is, because we are in a sort of a primitive biological, psychological level, still stuck back in our more animal period, we often interpret stimuli in an over-anxious way. It's almost like, and this is the point that Freud and some of the others were making, there's not an actual lion in the room, right? It's not like when we were in, primitive cave people or whatever, and we had to worry about a lion attacking us. There's no lion in this room that's going to attack me. But the problem is that my anxiety, it could be stimulated to reach that kind of a level where I feel like there's a lion there, even though there's not a lion. And so the challenge, according to Freud and some of these others, and if you've ever seen the TV show Hannibal, Hannibal Lecter actually makes reference to this, I believe, in the first episode. The challenge is to get yourself to recognize that there is not a lion, that the lion is what you yourself have created in your head or have blown up out of proportion, probably in some ways tied to early experiences that you had as a child and the traumas and the anxieties that we're talking about. And so the problem is that a lot of us, we have adult bodies, but we're actually children walking around. We still often have the same fears and thought processes and feelings as children. And so one of the things that we are challenged to do in dealing with our anxiety is to try to start teasing out in our minds what things are actually really consequential or even life-threatening and which things are not. And if you look at it that way, typically what you'll see is that there's a lot less to be anxious about than what you probably feel, right? Least of all, making somebody angry, pissing somebody off because you tell them no, right? And so I think that that's one of the things that's important to think about when we're thinking about anxiety, is the root of it. There's that really famous, is it Mark Twain? That really famous Mark Twain quote, something like, in my life, I've experienced a lot of horrible things. Some of them have actually happened. And I think that that's a really good way of thinking about this, right? How many things have you been stressed out about in your life that didn't come to pass? And how much time were you wasting being stressed out and anxious, right? Things will happen to you in the present, and you will deal with them in the present. But you don't need to dwell in the future. Take care of your shit, right? But don't dwell in the future waiting for some catastrophe that either is not going to come, or if it does come, is probably not going to be as bad or in the form that you thought it would be, right? There's a book that I like. It's not a particularly sophisticated book. It's got a pretty simple message, but if you struggle with anxiety, you might look this up. It's called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And what this book gets at, and I think this is an interesting idea, and it's not the first to get at it, is that so many of us today in society, we think that the way to deal with anxiety is to avoid triggers. Avoid negative stimuli, avoid bad memories, avoid watching a movie because it might set you off, right? Avoid talking about this, it might set you off. Well, in fact, there's actually a lot of psychological research to indicate that avoidance actually reinforces a particular fear or anxiety or trauma or phobia. And that's why, in fact, a number of new psychological treatments have revolved around ways to safely or more comfortably expose or re-expose people to their traumas. You know, even something like the, is it the EDMR or EMDR? I always get it mixed up with the blinking or whatever, right? You know, the idea is that someone sits there with you and they take you through your trauma, but they do it with these certain like physical things that you do that is supposed to, I guess, deal with it, right? That was a really scientific explanation. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. Tell me if you've had EMDR or EDMR. Tell me if you've had it, because I want to know. So avoidance doesn't work. Avoidance does not work. And this was the thinking behind this book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, is that if you are afraid of something, you should, in fact, try to expose yourself under safe circumstances, right? But try to expose yourself to that, right? So for instance, if I am terrified of public speaking, then what I should do perhaps is take a public speaking class or look for ways to speak in public more until that fear is eroded. Now, I think that personally there are a few strategies that have really helped me, all right? One of those strategies in dealing with anxiety, because let's face it, so much of our anxiety comes from the opinions or our anticipation of the opinions of other people, right? And I talked about this in my last video. It was a long video, but if you haven't checked it out, go look at the philosophy video that I just did. I'm going to link to it below. I talk a lot in that about this topic, and I've done several videos on this topic. One of them was called What Do We Owe Others? And it was about this same idea. Most of our anxiety in life, or a lot of our anxiety in life, comes from other people and what we think of as the expectations of other people, the requirements of other people, the pressure that we get from other people, that sort of thing, right? And so one of the things that's really helpful for me, and as I said, I've talked about this before, is to recognize that the opinions of other people are not real. They are not real, right? The people who are judging you, guess what's going to happen to them in a matter of decades? They're going to die. And when they die, their opinions are going to die with them. Actually, those opinions are going to die a long time before that, because those people are going to forget about what they said about you anyway, right? But those opinions are not real, right? They're only as real as they're only real in as much as you care about what that person actually thinks, and as much as that opinion will last. And it's not going to last. All these opinions are transient, they pass away. And if you live your life according to what other people expect from you, what you're going to find one day, you're going to wake up and realize that you missed out on your own life because you were scared of some opinions that weren't even real, that don't even matter, right? And so a lot of what I do whenever I feel anxiety is I remind myself that just like being in the Matrix, it's a kind of a simulation, and I don't really know fully what it is, but I know that the opinions of other people, they generally don't matter very much, and not nearly as much as we think that they do, all right? Your opinion of yourself, right? Can you answer to yourself for the way you're living your life? That's a more interesting question, I think, and to God, if you believe in God. And I think another thing that really helps me also is to imagine the worst case scenario. You know, a lot of people think that positive thinking is the way to deal with anxiety. And I just have to say that generally doesn't work very well for me. Just saying, I'm going to be positive, right? Come on. We all know too much about the world to just have that sort of blinded optimism, right? But what does often work for me is imagining the worst case scenario. And I'm not talking about like the absolute worst case scenario, like this planet blowing up right now or something. But I mean, in any given situation that you're worried about, imagine what you think to you is a somewhat likely worst case scenario. And then you imagine yourself dealing with it. And what you'll find is that 9 times out of 10, you can think your way through a scenario, and you can come out on the other end realizing that you'll deal with it, all right? Sometimes even the worst thing, you know, it's once you actually face it, you realize that it wasn't worth all the anxiety that you were putting into it. And so I think, you know, that, and I just want to say one other thing too about anxiety. And this is not one that I'm good at. It's one that I need to work on, okay? But look, our bodies and our minds, they evolved to get a great deal more exercise than we give them. all right? When you think about the way that most of our ancestors had lived, whether we want to go back to, Darwin and the apes, or we want to go to the cave people, or we want to think about, just 50 years ago for most of us, maybe a little longer. My grandparents were farmers. For the vast amount of human history, 99% of humans were engaged in extreme physical exertion, like all day, every day, most of the time, right? And so what you have to think about like when you're at an amusement park or you're traveling or something, and maybe you're doing a lot of walking, like one of those days where you just spend like the whole day walking around, right? That is maybe almost as much exercise as a typical ancestor would get. So we know that our bodies and our minds evolved to have a lot of physical exertion. And what we also know is that the more physical exertion you have, the more that your anxiety decreases. So look, I hate to just be obvious and to tell you obvious things, but the obvious truth about why so many of us have anxiety now is because most of us are getting far, far less physical exertion than we need. And so one thing that I might suggest is that if you are someone who is struggling with pervasive anxiety, you might try upping your exercise and see if that helps, all right? And that's just a practical thing that I think is helpful to keep in mind. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention, and that is that I do think it's interesting that anxiety seems to have increased so much at a time when society is relatively much more prosperous and much more safe than in the past. Now, I'm not talking about the news events of the last several years. I'm talking about overall trends that, like Steven Pinker and others have talked about, is that if we look at, century to century and decade to decade, what we see is that despite the fact that people are seemingly safer and healthier and more prosperous than they have been throughout human history, we also seem to have more anxiety. And there is some research to indicate that the better that your life is in terms of these quantifiable things like wealth, safety, health, and so forth, that actually the more anxiety you can have. I had a good friend who lived in what people would call a third world nation for many years. And one of the things that he observed, and he was not the first to note this, I've actually seen research indicating this, is that the people there seem to have much less neurosis, psychological neuroses, and much less anxiety than we find in the first world, Western world, right? That these developing nations, it seems like in so many ways they had so much more to be anxious about, their people, and yet they had less anxiety. And I think that there really is something to the fact that some of what we are afflicted by is a kind of affliction of affluence. And I'm not talking about affluenza necessarily, but what I'm saying is that it does seem to me that some of the students or some of the young people that I encounter who seem so heavily afflicted by anxiety also seem to have had rather sheltered lives. I'm not saying that they haven't had to deal with stuff. Everybody has to deal with stuff. But that it does seem to me that what we see is that the more generally sheltered or even perhaps coddled a group of people are, that actually the less tolerance they have for the problems that they do have, right? And we all understand this. I'm the same way, right? And so what does this tell us? Well, I think that it tells us the value of people reading history and reading about the state of the world beyond the confines of their narrow, perhaps sheltered lives. Because I'll tell you, one of the things that becoming an educated person did for me in terms of learning about history, reading about some of the horrible things that people have been through, seeing it in film and reading about it in literature, is it gives you a real appreciation for what actual horror is. To quote Colonel Kurtz, horror has a face, and you must make a friend of horror. Now, what does that mean, make a friend of horror? It means that horror is a very real aspect of this life and this world. And if you seek through your whole life to try to run away from that fact, or you seek in the way that you raise your children to try to completely shelter them from that fact, that you're actually not doing yourself or them a favor. Because this is a rough world. And I do think it's interesting sometimes that the people who seem less equipped to deal with it are also the ones who seem to have had very sheltered lives. Not always, but sometimes. So anyway, that's something to think about. Now, a lot of anxiety that we feel has a lot of complicated roots, and I talked a little bit earlier about our relationships with other people. I think that in a deeper sense, though, and this is kind of the last thing I want to get to, and if you're interested in this, look at the video that I just did, because I talk about this a lot more in a lot more depth. I do think that there's a lot of anxiety that people feel when they know that they are not on the right path in life. I think there is a kind of existential anxiety that can come from knowing that your life script, that you have given up your life script, and you're kind of just letting life run away with you. And, you know, there's that old question, are you running your life, or is your life running you, right? And all of us, to a degree, our life is running us, right? I mean, that's part of the human experience, actually, is to sort of lay back and let your life take you where it will. But at the same time, there's a balance to be had between that sort of, you know, Buddhist acceptance of life, and also the need to own your life script. And so if you don't know what I mean by that, I invite you to look at any of my other philosophy videos where I talk about life, and I'll have them linked below. But I get into this in a lot of detail, and I think you'll find it beneficial. All right, I'm going to have a lot more stuff out soon along these lines, and also some of the other celebrity stuff. So as always, I appreciate it if you support my work. Like and subscribe. Hit me up on PayPal and Patreon. You don't have to be a member to donate. Thanks. Bye-bye.